Konnichiwa. Today we're going to talk about mistakes in Japanese and how they're a good thing, how you ought to be making them. Every now and again I poke a little bit of gentle fun at what I call the best China or bone China school of Japanese. Those people who think you need to keep your Japanese in a glass case and never dare to use it in case you make a mistake, because a mistake will ruin your Japanese forever. Now, I want to go on record as saying there's only one thing that will ruin your Japanese forever. Even the completely misleading structure of Eihongo Japanese grammar as taught in Genki and the Japanese grammar websites won't actually ruin your Japanese, although it'll give it a good shot. If you use your Japanese, you will, in the end, assimilate it, even despite that misinformation. Of course, it'll be a lot quicker if you get information on the real structure, but even if you don't, it is not the end of the world. People have, for generations, learned Japanese despite the misinformation of Eihongo Japanese grammar, and they've done so by using it. The only thing that will really ruin your Japanese forever is not using it. And that's why making people afraid to use it is absolutely the worst thing you can do if you're trying to help people to learn Japanese. So where does this myth come from? Where does the idea come from that you ought to be very hesitant about actually using your Japanese because you might ruin it by a mistake? Well, first of all, of course, the old-fashioned, traditional, exam-oriented teaching of Japanese is wary of mistakes because mistakes lose you points in exams. And that's just about the most rational reason for being terrified of mistakes that I can think of. It gets worse from there because the main people who are spreading this mistake phobia aren't straight-laced school teachers. They're postmodern, immersion-oriented Japanese enthusiasts. Now, why would they, like the school teachers, be terrified of mistakes? Well, let's look into the history of it for a moment. This whole bone China, best China attitude to Japanese really, in its recent internet-based form, stems from Ajat. But it doesn't start there. Ajat itself mostly comes from a site called Antimoon. Almost everything that's in Ajat was originally in Antimoon, and to be fair, Katsumoto-san always openly admitted that. Now, Antimoon is a site for foreign people to learn English. It's run, I believe, by some Polish gentlemen, and it has a lot of information. Some of it's very good. And Ajat took over a lot of this information wholesale. Now, since a lot of it's good information, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Where it becomes a bad thing is when it fails to notice that you can't apply things from one situation to a completely different situation. And the situation of Antimoon and its intended audience is completely different from the situation of Ajat and all the various successors to Ajat and their intended audience. What is the difference? Well, let's take a look at Antimoon. Here it is. This is the front page of Antimoon. What do you make of it immediately? What do you notice straight away? What you ought to notice, bearing in mind that this is a site for foreign learners of English, is that it's in what language? It's in English. Now, admittedly, some of the pages have been translated into other languages. If you happen to speak Spanish, quite a lot of them have been translated into your language. If you speak any language other than Spanish, only a few, if any, have been translated into your language, which means that most of the users of Antimoon are reading it in English. So let's consider another question. If Ajat had been written in all Japanese from the beginning, how much influence do you think it would have had? on the English language Japanese learning community, how famous do you think it would have become? I think we can safely say it would have had almost no influence, and very few people would even have heard of it. Why not? Well, essentially because most of the people coming to Ajat to learn Japanese didn't, at least when they started, know enough Japanese to read about Ajat in Japanese. But clearly, the people who go to Anti-Moon are a very different sort of people. Compared to the people who go to Ajat in order to learn Japanese, they're really going to a site where they can read all about learning about English in English. In other words, what they're really doing is polishing their English, not learning it from the ground up. And this is very important, because if you're talking about polishing a skill that you've already got, most of the people reading Ajat in the early stages, most of the people perhaps watching this video, are aiming to be at the level where they can read websites in Japanese with very little trouble. The people doing Anti-Moon are already at that level. So when you're talking about polishing language, it may be good advice to say, be very careful of ever making a mistake, because this is what Anti-Moon says, and this is what Ajat took over from Anti-Moon uncritically whole, when it might make sense if you're polishing. I don't know. I'm inclined to doubt it, but it might. However, notice that all those people who are being told at Anti-Moon that they must never make a mistake are being told that in English. They got to that stage in English probably making mistakes the way most learners of language do. Now both Ajat and Anti-Moon justify their stance on mistakes by citing Stephen Krashen sensei, who believes in input in language, and he also believes that while you're learning language, there should be a silent period, a period in which you have input only, but you don't do what he calls output, which is to say speaking and writing. And lots of the Bone China, West China school of Japanese cite Stephen Krashen to show that science proves that they're right. Now, even accepting that Stephen Krashen sensei is indeed the voice of science from above, and accepting that he does advocate a silent period, how long is that silent period? If you actually look into it, the silent period recommended by Stephen Krashen is around 3 months. Now, if you listen to most members of the Best China School, you'd think it was 3 years, at least. And the thing is that Stephen Krashen, all his work is based around classroom teaching. So what he's saying is that for the first 3 months, don't get involved in those silly conversations where you back and forth words you barely understand, which is done in most school language teaching. And I have no opinion on that. I don't know whether it's necessarily a bad thing, and I don't think it's a particularly good thing either. I don't think it matters much whether you do or don't try to talk in the first 3 months. But here's the crowning irony. The reason Stephen Krashen doesn't think you should talk in the first 3 months is not in case you pick up terrible mistakes or ruin your language forever. It's because he believes, and I believe, that being too concerned about getting everything right, being too concerned, in fact, about not making mistakes, inhibits you very badly from progressing in the learning of language. So, from his point of view, it makes great sense in the classroom not to put people in a position where they have to be using language that they barely understand yet, and they're bound to be worrying and fretting about whether they're making mistakes or not. The fear of mistakes is a huge inhibitor, and Stephen Krashen, more than most educators, has stressed that very fact. And if we are afraid of mistakes, and if we do stretch the so-called silent period far beyond anything Krashen sensei ever intended, we're doing something else that's extremely damaging, and that's this. Your mind, as I've said before, has a very special privileged place reserved for what it regards as language. And what it regards as language is the thing you use to communicate. It privileges it because it's necessary to survival, and it is the primary means by which our thinking takes place. And because of that, it doesn't treat it like algebra or chess, and it doesn't treat it like Spanish we learned in school and never ended up being able to say anything much beyond buenas noches. All those things, as far as the mind is concerned, games, mathematical constructs, foreign languages that we're just learning, all of those things are non-essential. They don't get the privileged position that language needs. What gets the privileged position that language needs is what we are using for real communication, for taking in information, for giving out information, for exchanging ideas, for essentially living the life of an intelligent being which is based on language, not on languages, but on language. So the only way that you can induce the mind to take Japanese seriously as language, instead of just a language, which is a kind of game, is to be using it and inhibiting people from using it, making them afraid to use it, stopping them from jumping in by spreading myths about if you put your feet in the water they'll freeze and you lose your toes forever, is the worst thing you can do, because making mistakes does not ruin your Japanese. Only one thing ruins your Japanese, and that thing is not using it. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the comments below, and I will answer as usual. I'd like to thank my Gold Kokeshi patrons, my producer angels who make these videos possible, and all my patrons and supporters on Patreon and everywhere. And I'd like to thank you for attending this lesson. Korekara mo yoroshiku onegai shimasu. Class dismissed.